Scott Cox could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he stood in the doorway of his best friend's apartment, rain dripping from his dark hair onto the hardwood floor. The storm outside had nothing on the tempest raging inside his chest. Douglas Watson looked up from his laptop, concern immediately flooding his warm brown eyes as he took in Scott's soaked appearance and the vulnerability written across his face like an open book. "Can I fall asleep right here?" Douglas had whispered just minutes ago, his voice barely audible over the thunder rolling across the city. The words hung in the air between them now, heavy with meaning that neither of them had been brave enough to acknowledge until this moment. Scott's breath caught as he realized that everything was about to change, that the careful balance they had maintained for months was finally tipping toward something neither of them could control. But to understand how they had arrived at this precipice, this moment where friendship balanced on the knife's edge of something deeper, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when Scott first realized that the safety he felt with Douglas might mean something more than either of them had been willing to admit. 3 months earlier, Scott had been sitting in his favorite coffee shop, staring at his phone screen with growing frustration. Another dating app notification, another potential match that felt as hollow as all the others. He had been going through the motions of dating for months, meeting women who were perfectly nice, perfectly attractive, perfectly wrong for him in ways he could not articulate. There was always something missing, some essential spark that everyone else seemed to find so easily. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Scott looked up to see Douglas walking in, his messenger bag slung over one shoulder, and that easy smile that always made Scott's chest tighten in ways he refused to examine too closely. Douglas spotted him immediately, weaving through the crowded tables with the kind of casual confidence that Scott had always envied. "Hey, stranger," Douglas said as he slid into the seat across from Scott, his fingers already working to unwrap the scarf from around his neck. "I was hoping I'd find you here. You've been avoiding my calls." Scott felt heat creep up his neck as he set his phone face down on the table. He had been avoiding Douglas's calls, but not for the reasons his friend might assume. The truth was that every conversation with Douglas lately left Scott feeling more confused about things he thought he had figured out years ago. There was something about the way Douglas looked at him sometimes, something in the comfortable silences they shared, that made Scott question everything he thought he knew about himself. "Just been busy with work," Scott lied, taking a sip of his now cold coffee to avoid meeting Douglas's eyes. "You know how it is." Douglas leaned back in his chair, studying Scott with the kind of attention that always made him feel simultaneously seen and terrified. That was the thing about Douglas. He never let Scott hide behind easy excuses or surface-level explanations. He had this way of looking right through all the walls Scott had spent years building, seeing straight to the heart of whatever was really bothering him. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. "Actually, I don't think I do know how it is," Douglas said quietly, his voice carrying that gentle persistence that Scott had come to both love and fear. "You've been different lately. Distant, like you're carrying something heavy and you don't want to let anyone help you with it." Scott's fingers tightened around his coffee cup as he felt a familiar ache in his chest that seemed to appear whenever Douglas showed him this kind of care. It was the same feeling he had been trying to ignore for months now. The growing awareness that his feelings for his best friend had shifted into territory that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm fine, Doug. Really, just trying to figure some things out." Douglas reached across the table and covered Scott's hand with his own, the simple touch sending electricity up Scott's arm. The contact was brief, friendly, the kind of gesture that should have felt completely normal between two close friends. But Scott found himself cataloging every detail: the warmth of Douglas's palm, the way his thumb brushed across Scott's knuckles before he pulled away. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Douglas said, his voice soft with genuine concern. "Whatever it is you're trying to figure out, you don't have to do it alone." Scott felt something crack open in his chest at the sincerity in Douglas's voice. This was exactly the problem. Douglas was too good, too caring, too willing to be there for Scott in ways that made it impossible to maintain any kind of emotional distance. Every act of friendship felt like a small gift that Scott treasured far more than he should. "I know," Scott managed, his voice rougher than he intended. I know I can talk to you. It's just complicated. Douglas tilted his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When has anything between us ever been simple, he said, and Scott felt his heart skip at the implication in those words. We've been friends for what, 5 years now? I think we can handle complicated. The thing was, Scott was not sure they could handle this particular kind of complicated. How could he explain to Douglas that he had started looking forward to their weekly coffee dates more than actual dates with women? How could he tell him that he had begun measuring every potential relationship against the easy intimacy he shared with Douglas, and that everyone else came up short? How could he admit that somewhere along the way, friendship had transformed into something that felt dangerously close to being in love? Tell me about this new woman you have been seeing, Douglas said, clearly trying to shift the conversation to safer ground. Sarah, right. How's that going? Scott's stomach clenched at the mention of Sarah Ruiz, the perfectly lovely woman he had been dating for the past month. Sarah was everything he should want, smart, funny, attractive, interested in him. But every date with her felt like he was playing a role, pretending to be someone he was not sure he actually was. It's going fine, Scott said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She's great, really great. But, Douglas prompted, clearly hearing the hesitation in Scott's voice. Scott looked up to meet Douglas's eyes and felt that familiar jolt of connection that he never experienced with Sarah or any of the other women he had dated. There was something in Douglas's gaze, an intensity that made Scott feel like he was the only person in the crowded coffee shop, like Douglas could see straight through to his soul. But I don't feel anything, Scott admitted quietly. I mean, I like her. I enjoy spending time with her. But there's no spark, no excitement. It feels like I'm going through the motions. Douglas leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. What do you think is missing? That was the question Scott had been asking himself for months. The question that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling. What was missing from his relationships with women? What was this essential thing that everyone else seemed to find so easily? Why did he feel more alive during a simple conversation with Douglas than he did during intimate moments with women he was supposed to be attracted to? I don't know, Scott said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were not entirely true. He did know, or at least he suspected, but admitting it would mean acknowledging feelings that could change everything between them. Feelings that might cost him the most important relationship in his life. Douglas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that Scott recognized as nervous energy. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Can I ask you something, and will you promise to answer honestly? Scott's heart rate picked up, but he nodded. When you're with Sarah or any of the women you've dated, do you ever find yourself thinking about someone else? The question hit Scott like a physical blow. He felt heat flood his face as he realized that Douglas had somehow gotten to the heart of everything Scott had been trying to hide. Because yes, he did think about someone else when he was with Sarah. He thought about Douglas's laugh, about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, about the comfortable silences they shared that felt more intimate than anything Scott had experienced with any woman. Why would you ask me that? Scott said, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I've been watching you for months, and you seem miserable every time you talk about dating. Like you're forcing yourself to want something you don't actually want. Douglas's words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Scott's chest tight with anxiety. He felt exposed, like Douglas had somehow seen through all his carefully constructed defenses to the truth Scott had been hiding even from himself. Maybe I'm just not ready for a serious relationship, Scott said weakly, grasping for any explanation that did not require him to examine his feelings too closely. Or maybe, Douglas said gently, you're looking for something different than what you think you're supposed to want. The conversation was interrupted by Scott's phone buzzing against the table, a text from Sarah asking if he wanted to grab dinner that night. Scott stared at the message, feeling a familiar sense of dread at the thought of another evening of pretending to feel something he did not. You should go, Douglas said, nodding toward the phone. Don't keep her waiting because of me. But Scott did not want to go. He wanted to stay here in this coffee shop with Douglas, talking about everything and nothing, feeling more like himself than he had in months. He wanted to explore the thread of conversation Douglas had started, to understand what his friend meant by looking for something different. Actually, Scott said, typing a quick response to Sarah, I think I need to take a break from dating for a while, figure some things out. Douglas's expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief, though Scott might have been imagining it. That sounds like a good idea, he said. Sometimes you have to stop looking outside yourself to figure out what you actually want. Over the next few weeks, Scott found himself spending more and more time with Douglas. What had started as their usual weekly coffee dates expanded into long walks through the city, movie nights at Douglas's apartment, lazy Sunday afternoons reading in comfortable silence. Without the distraction of dating, Scott began to notice things about their friendship that he had been unconsciously suppressing. He noticed the way Douglas would unconsciously move closer to him on the couch during their movie nights, their shoulders touching as they shared a bowl of popcorn. He noticed how Douglas's face would light up when Scott walked into a room, like Scott's presence genuinely made his day better. He noticed the way their conversations flowed effortlessly from serious topics to silly jokes, the way they could communicate entire thoughts with just a look. Most unsettling of all, Scott noticed how right it all felt. How being with Douglas felt like coming home in a way that being with Sarah or any other woman never had. It was during one of these movie nights that everything shifted. They were watching some action movie that neither of them was really paying attention to, sprawled across Douglas's couch with empty pizza boxes on the coffee table. Scott was hyper-aware of Douglas's presence beside him, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his breathing had grown slow and even. "Scott," Douglas said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise from the television. "Yeah, can I tell you something?" Scott turned to look at Douglas and found him staring at the ceiling, his profile outlined by the flickering light from the screen. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made Scott's heart rate pick up. "Of course. I've been thinking about what we talked about that day in the coffee shop, about looking for something different than what you think you're supposed to want." Scott held his breath, afraid to move or speak in case it broke whatever spell was allowing Douglas to be this open. "I think I might know what you meant about not feeling anything with the women you've been dating." The words hit Scott like a freight train. He turned on the couch to face Douglas fully, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Douglas finally looked at him, and Scott saw his own confusion and fear reflected in his friend's eyes. "I don't know what I'm saying," Douglas admitted. "I just know that I've been thinking about things I've never thought about before. About you. About us." The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with possibility and terror. Scott felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, one step away from either flying or falling. "What kind of things?" Scott asked, his voice barely audible. Douglas sat up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Scott recognized as nervous energy. "Like why I look forward to seeing you more than anyone else. Why every woman I've dated has felt like she was missing something essential. Why I feel more myself when I'm with you than when I'm with anyone else." Scott's breath caught as he realized that Douglas was voicing all the same thoughts that had been plaguing him for months. The relief of not being alone in his confusion was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a new kind of fear. If they were both feeling this, if this was real, then everything was about to change. "Doug," Scott said carefully, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I think I might not be as straight as I thought I was," Douglas said, the words coming out in a rush like he had been holding them back for weeks. "I'm saying that when I imagine my future, when I think about being truly happy, you're always there, and not just as my friend." Scott felt the world tilt on its axis. Everything he had been afraid to hope for was suddenly being offered to him, but the terror was just as strong as the joy. This was Douglas, his best friend, the most important person in his life. If this went wrong, if they tried this and it did not work, he could lose everything. "I've been feeling the same way," Scott admitted, his voice shaking. "For months now. I kept telling myself it was just because we're close, because our friendship is so important to me. But I think it's more than that." Douglas reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against Scott's hand. The touch sent electricity shooting up Scott's arm, just like it had in the coffee shop. But this time, neither of them pulled away. "I'm scared," Douglas whispered. "Me too." They sat there in the flickering light from the television, hands barely touching, both of them trembling with the weight of what they had just admitted. Scott felt like he was in a dream, like any moment he might wake up and find that this conversation had never happened. "What do we do now?" Scott asked. Douglas's fingers intertwined with his, the contact sending warmth spreading through Scott's chest. "I don't know," he said. "I've never felt like this about another man before. I don't know what it means or where it leads. Do you want to find out?" Douglas looked up to meet Scott's eyes, and the intensity Scott saw there took his breath away. "Yes," he said simply. "I think I do." The next few weeks passed in a blur of tentative exploration and growing intimacy. They did not rush into anything physical, instead spending their time talking through their feelings, trying to understand what was happening between them. Douglas would come over to Scott's apartment after work, and they would cook dinner together, their movements around the kitchen becoming an unconscious dance of proximity and careful touches. Scott found himself cataloging every moment of contact, the way Douglas's hand would brush his when they reached for the same ingredient, the way their shoulders would bump as they worked side by side. These small touches felt more electric than anything Scott had experienced in his previous relationships, charged with possibility and the thrill of the unknown. They talked about everything during those weeks, about their past relationships, about the things they had always thought they wanted, about the growing realization that they had been looking for each other all along without knowing it. Douglas admitted that he had been comparing every woman he dated to Scott, measuring their conversations against the easy intimacy he shared with his best friend, and finding them lacking. "I think I've been in love with you for a while now," Douglas said one evening as they sat on Scott's couch, the remains of takeout containers scattered across the coffee table. "I just didn't have the vocabulary to understand what I was feeling." Scott felt his heart stop and restart at the casual way Douglas said the words, like he was commenting on the weather rather than changing Scott's entire world. "How long?" Scott asked. Douglas was quiet for a moment, his fingers playing with the hem of his shirt. "Remember last year when you were dating that woman from your office? Jennifer." Scott nodded, remembering the brief relationship that had ended when Jennifer accused him of being emotionally unavailable. "I was so jealous," Douglas continued, "not just because I missed spending time with you, but because I wanted to be the one you were excited to see. I wanted to be the one you talked about with that smile in your voice. I told myself it was just because I was being a selfish friend. But looking back, I think it was more than that." Scott reached out and took Douglas's hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "I broke up with Jennifer because I realized I was thinking about you during our dates," he admitted. "I kept wishing she was funnier like you, or that she understood me the way you do. It felt wrong to be with her when all I wanted was to come home and tell you about my day." They were sitting closer now, their knees touching, hands intertwined. Scott could feel the warmth radiating from Douglas's body, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. The urge to close the distance between them was almost overwhelming, but Scott was still afraid to push too fast. "Can I ask you something?" Douglas said, his voice soft and hesitant. "Anything. Have you ever thought about kissing me?" The question sent heat flooding through Scott's body. He had thought about it, more than he cared to admit. Late at night when he could not sleep, during their movie nights when Douglas would laugh at something on screen and Scott would find himself staring at his mouth. But admitting it felt like crossing a line they could never uncross. "Yes," Scott said quietly, "have you?" "All the time," Douglas admitted, his thumb tracing patterns across Scott's knuckles. "Especially lately. I'll be talking to you about something completely normal, and then I'll look at your mouth and lose track of what I was saying." Scott's breath caught as he processed Douglas's words. The idea that his friend had been having the same thoughts, the same desires, felt almost too good to be true. "What's stopping you?" Scott asked, surprised by his own boldness. Douglas looked up to meet his eyes, and Scott saw a mixture of want and fear that mirrored his own feelings. "The same thing that's stopping you, I think. Once we cross that line, everything changes. We can't go back to just being friends." "Do you want to go back?" Scott asked. "No," Douglas said immediately. "I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. Being with you like this, talking about these feelings, it's like I've been holding my breath for years and I can finally exhale." Scott felt tears prick at his eyes at the raw honesty in Douglas's voice. He understood exactly what his friend meant, because he felt the same way. Like some essential part of himself that he had been suppressing was finally being allowed to exist. "I love you," Scott said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. "Not just as my friend. I'm in love with you, Doug." Douglas's eyes widened, and for a terrifying moment, Scott thought he had said too much, moved too fast. But then Douglas was smiling, that brilliant smile that had always made Scott's chest tight with affection, and Scott realized that his fear had been unfounded. "I love you too," Douglas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I've been in love with you since the day we met. I just didn't understand what that feeling was." They sat there looking at each other, both of them trembling with the weight of what they had just confessed. Scott felt like his heart might burst from the poignant relief flooding through him. All those months of confusion and fear, all those failed relationships and sleepless nights, had led to this moment. Douglas leaned forward slowly, giving Scott plenty of time to pull away if he wanted to. But Scott did not want to pull away. He had never wanted anything more than he wanted to close the distance between them, to finally understand what it would feel like to kiss the man he had fallen in love with. "Can I?" Douglas whispered, his breath warm against Scott's lips. "Please," Scott breathed. The first touch of Douglas's lips against his was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. Scott felt electricity shoot through his entire body as he realized that this was really happening, that Douglas was really kissing him. He responded by deepening the kiss slightly, his hand coming up to cup Douglas's face. The kiss was everything Scott had imagined and nothing like he had expected. It was soft and warm and tasted like the wine they had shared with dinner. But more than that, it felt right in a way that no kiss ever had before. Like coming home, like finding a missing piece of himself he had not even known was lost. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Douglas rested his forehead against Scott's, his eyes still closed, a small smile playing at his lips. "Wow," he whispered. "Yeah," Scott agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Wow." They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Scott felt like he was in a dream, like any moment he might wake up and find that this perfect moment had never happened. "How do you feel?" Douglas asked quietly. "Like I've been waiting my whole life for this," Scott admitted. "Like everything finally makes sense." Douglas pulled back slightly to look at Scott, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was so scared that if I told you how I felt, I'd lose you completely," he said. "I never imagined that you might feel the same way." Scott reached up to trace his thumb along Douglas's cheekbone, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to touch him like this now. "I was scared too," he said. "You're the most important person in my life, Doug. The thought of losing you was terrifying." "You're not going to lose me," Douglas said firmly. "If anything, I feel like I'm finally finding you. The real you, not the version you've been trying to be for everyone else." Scott felt tears spill over at Douglas's words. His friend was right. He had been trying to be someone else for so long that he had almost forgotten who he really was. But with Douglas, he did not have to pretend. He could just be himself, and that was enough. They spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing, exploring this new dimension of their relationship with the careful wonder of people who could not quite believe their good fortune. Scott felt like he was floating, high on the realization that his feelings were reciprocated, that the man he loved was holding him and telling him that he loved him back. When it got late, Douglas hesitated at the door, clearly reluctant to leave. Scott felt the same reluctance, not wanting to break the spell of intimacy they had created. "Stay," Scott said impulsively. "I mean, if you want to. We don't have to do anything. I just don't want tonight to end yet." Douglas's face lit up with relief. "I was hoping you'd ask," he admitted. "I don't think I'm ready to go back to my empty apartment and pretend this didn't happen." They got ready for bed with a new kind of nervous energy, both of them acutely aware that this was another first, another line they were crossing. Scott lent Douglas a pair of pajamas, and they brushed their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink like they had done countless times before during sleepovers. Except now, everything felt different. When they finally settled into Scott's bed, there was a moment of awkward uncertainty. They had shared beds before during trips or when one of them had too much to drink, but this felt different, more intimate, more charged with possibility. Douglas solved the problem by reaching for Scott's hand under the covers, intertwining their fingers. "Is this okay?" he asked. "More than okay," Scott said, squeezing Douglas's hand gently. They lay there in the dark, talking quietly about their hopes and fears for this new relationship. Douglas admitted that he was nervous about what his family would think, about how his coworkers might react if they found out. Scott shared his own anxieties about navigating a relationship with another man when he had no experience or roadmap to follow. But despite their fears, there was an underlying current of joy and rightness that made everything else seem manageable. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. "We'll figure it out," Douglas said as they finally began to drift off to sleep. "Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." Scott squeezed his hand one more time, feeling a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in years. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. Scott woke up the next morning to the unfamiliar but wonderful sensation of Douglas's arm draped across his chest. For a moment he lay still, afraid that moving might break the spell and reveal that the previous night had been nothing but a vivid dream. But Douglas was real and warm and breathing softly against his neck, and Scott felt his heart swell with a happiness so intense it was almost painful. Douglas stirred as the morning light filtered through the curtains, his arm tightening around Scott before his eyes fluttered open. When he saw Scott watching him, a slow smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Scott replied, unable to keep the grin off his own face. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Douglas admitted, propping himself up on his elbow to look down at Scott. "I kept waking up and remembering that this was real, that you were really here." Scott reached up to smooth down Douglas's messy hair, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to touch him like this now. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "I feel like I'm in some kind of beautiful dream." They lay there for a while longer, talking softly and trading lazy kisses, neither of them wanting to break the intimate bubble they had created. But eventually the demands of the real world intruded, and they had to get up and face the day. Over breakfast, they talked about what came next. They both agreed that they wanted to take things slow, to give themselves time to adjust to this new dynamic, without rushing into anything they were not ready for. They decided to keep their relationship private for now, at least until they had a better sense of what they meant to each other. "I want to do this right," Douglas said as they sat across from each other at Scott's kitchen table, sharing coffee and toast like they had done countless times before as friends. "You're too important to me to mess this up by moving too fast." Scott felt his heart squeeze with affection at the careful way Douglas was approaching their new relationship. It was so typical of him to be thoughtful and considerate, to put Scott's feelings and their friendship above his own desires. "I want to do this right too," Scott said, reaching across the table to take Douglas's hand. "But I also don't want to overthink it so much that we miss out on something beautiful." Douglas smiled and brought Scott's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. "I don't think there's any danger of that," he said. "What we have is too strong to be derailed by a little overthinking." Over the next few weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. They still spent most of their free time together, but now their movie nights included cuddling on the couch, and their dinner dates ended with long, sweet kisses at Scott's front door. They were learning each other in new ways, discovering the small intimacies that came with romantic love. Scott learned that Douglas liked to trace patterns on his skin when they were lying together, that he made soft, humming sounds when he was content, that he had a habit of stealing Scott's hoodies and wearing them home. Douglas learned that Scott was more tactile than he had ever let on, that he loved having his hair played with, that he got shy and tongue-tied when Douglas looked at him with too much intensity. They had their first fight 3 weeks into their relationship, a stupid argument about where to go for dinner that escalated into something bigger about communication and expectations. Scott stormed out of Douglas's apartment, his heart breaking at the thought that maybe they had been fooling themselves. Maybe friendship and romance were too different to successfully combine. But Douglas showed up at his door 2 hours later with flowers and an apology, and they talked through their fears and insecurities until the early hours of the morning. The fight had been scary, but working through it together made Scott feel more confident about their relationship, not less. "We're going to mess up sometimes," Douglas said as they lay in Scott's bed afterward, Douglas's fingers combing gently through his hair. "We're both new at this, and we're bound to make mistakes, but I'd rather figure it out with you than be with anyone else." Scott pressed a kiss to Douglas's chest right over his heart. "I love you," he said simply, "even when you're being stubborn and impossible." "I love you too," Douglas replied, his voice warm with laughter. especially when you were being dramatic and storming out of my apartment. The real test came 6 weeks into their relationship when Douglas's sister, Dorothy Campbell, came to visit for a long weekend. Douglas had always been close with Dorothy, and Scott knew that her opinion mattered to him more than almost anyone else's. The thought of meeting her as Douglas's boyfriend, rather than just his friend, was terrifying. "She's going to love you," Douglas assured Scott, as they cleaned his apartment in preparation for Dorothy's arrival. "She already loves you as my friend. This won't change that." But Scott could not shake his anxiety. What if Dorothy did not approve of their relationship? What if she thought Scott was not good enough for her brother? Or worse, what if she was uncomfortable with Douglas dating a man and tried to talk him out of it? When Dorothy arrived, she greeted Scott with the same warm hug she always had. But Scott thought he detected a new curiosity in her eyes as she looked between him and Douglas. They had decided to tell her about their relationship that first evening, not wanting to spend the entire weekend pretending to be just friends. "Dorothy," Douglas said as they sat around his living room after dinner, "Scott and I have something we want to tell you." Dorothy set down her wine glass and looked at them expectantly. Scott felt his heart rate pick up as he realized this was really happening, that they were about to come out to the first member of Douglas's family. "We're together," Douglas said simply, "as in, we're dating. We're in love." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Scott felt panic begin to rise in his chest, but then Dorothy's face broke into a huge smile. Finally, she said, laughing, "I was wondering when you two were going to figure it out." Scott blinked in surprise. "You knew, honey?" Dorothy said, turning to Scott with an amused expression. "I've been watching my brother look at you like you hung the moon for years, and you've been looking back at him the same way. I was starting to think you were both blind." Douglas laughed, the sound filled with relief and joy. "So you're okay with it?" "I'm more than okay with it," Dorothy said, reaching over to squeeze both of their hands. "I'm thrilled. I've never seen Douglas as happy as he is when he's with you, Scott. And now I understand why." The weekend passed in a blur of easy conversation and family bonding. Dorothy regaled Scott with embarrassing stories from Douglas's childhood, and Douglas retaliated by telling her about Scott's most awkward dating disasters from before they got together. Scott felt himself relaxing as he realized that nothing fundamental had changed. Dorothy still treated him like family, still included him in inside jokes and sibling banter. On Dorothy's last night, she pulled Scott aside while Douglas was in the kitchen making coffee. "I want you to know how grateful I am," she said quietly. "Douglas has been searching for something his whole life, and I think he's finally found it with you. He's more himself when he's with you than I've ever seen him with anyone else." Scott felt tears prick at his eyes at the sincerity in her voice. "He means everything to me," he said. "I never thought I could feel this way about anyone." "That's exactly what he said about you," Dorothy replied with a smile. "You two are perfect for each other. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." When Douglas returned with coffee, he found Scott and Dorothy hugging, both of them a little teary-eyed. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Everything's perfect," Dorothy said, pulling her brother into the hug as well. "I'm just happy for you both." That night, as they lay in bed after Dorothy's departure, Douglas was quiet and thoughtful. Scott could sense that something was weighing on his mind. "What are you thinking about?" Scott asked, turning on his side to face him. "Just how lucky I am," Douglas said softly. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what I wanted from life. I had everything planned out, and none of those plans included falling in love with my best friend." "Do you regret it?" Scott asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Not for a second," Douglas said immediately, turning to look at Scott with an intensity that took his breath away. "This is the best thing that's ever happened to me." "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Scott felt his heart swell with so much love, he thought it might burst. "I love you," he said, leaning in to kiss Douglas softly. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Douglas whispered against his lips. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." As summer turned to fall, Scott and Douglas settled into a comfortable routine as a couple. They had told their closest friends about their relationship, and while there had been some surprise, the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Scott's coworkers had been supportive when he finally worked up the courage to bring Douglas to the office holiday party, and Douglas's family had welcomed Scott with open arms. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when Scott would catch himself wondering if he was really gay or if Douglas was just the exception to his otherwise straight orientation. But these doubts became less frequent as their relationship deepened, replaced by a growing certainty that what they had was real and lasting. They moved in together just before Christmas, combining their belongings and their lives in Douglas's slightly larger apartment. Scott had been nervous about the transition, worried that living together might reveal incompatibilities they had not noticed before. But instead, he found that sharing daily life with Douglas felt as natural as breathing. He loved waking up next to Douglas every morning, loved the way they moved around each other in the kitchen while making breakfast, loved the quiet evenings they spent reading together on the couch. Even the mundane aspects of cohabitation, like doing laundry and grocery shopping, felt special when they did them together. It was during one of these quiet domestic moments that Scott realized he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Douglas. They were decorating their Christmas tree, arguing playfully about ornament placement, when Douglas laughed at something Scott said and the sound hit him like a physical force. This was it. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but partnership. Not just attraction, but deep, abiding affection. Not just romance, but friendship and respect, and the comfortable intimacy that came from truly knowing another person. "I want to marry you someday," Scott said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Douglas froze with a silver ornament halfway to the tree, his eyes wide with surprise. Scott felt panic begin to rise in his chest. It was too soon, too much, too fast. Scott started to backtrack, not right away or anything. "I just meant that someday, if you wanted to, I would want to." Douglas set down the ornament and crossed the small space between them, cupping Scott's face in his hands. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes," Scott repeated, not quite believing what he was hearing. "Yes, I want to marry you someday too," Douglas clarified, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to build a life with you, Scott. I want everything with you." Scott felt tears spill over as Douglas kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. They had come so far from that confused conversation in the coffee shop 9 months ago, from the tentative friendship that had slowly transformed into something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. The Christmas tree stood half decorated behind them, forgotten in the face of this new milestone in their relationship. "I love you," Scott said, the words feeling both familiar and new. "I love you so much, Doug. I love you too," Douglas replied, resting his forehead against Scott's. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Scott's life. He felt like he had finally found his place in the world, finally understood what all those love songs and romantic movies had been talking about. Being with Douglas was like having a constant source of warmth and light in his life, someone who made even the most ordinary days feel special. They traveled together for the first time that spring, taking a long weekend trip to a cabin in the mountains. Scott had been nervous about how they would handle being together 24/7 in a confined space, but the trip only reinforced his certainty that Douglas was the person he wanted to spend his life with. They hiked during the day and cooked together in the evenings, talking and laughing and making love with the easy intimacy of a couple who had found their rhythm. Scott felt more relaxed and happy than he had in years, free from the constant low-level anxiety that had plagued him when he was trying to force himself to want things he did not actually want. On their last night at the cabin, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Douglas's arm around Scott's shoulders as they shared a bottle of wine. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the kind of contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged. "I've been thinking," Douglas said eventually, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "About what?" Scott asked, tilting his head to look at him. "About how different my life is now compared to a year ago. How much happier I am. How much more myself I feel." Scott smiled, understanding exactly what Douglas meant. "I know," he said. "Sometimes I look back at the person I was before we got together, and I barely recognize him. I was so lost, trying to be someone I wasn't." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't figured it out?" Douglas asked. "If we had just stayed friends and kept dating other people?" Scott shuddered at the thought. "I try not to think about it," he admitted. The idea of missing out on this on us is too depressing. Douglas tightened his arm around Scott, pulling him closer. I don't think we would have missed it, he said. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually. This feels too right, too inevitable, to have been left to chance. Scott felt his heart squeeze with love at Douglas's words. He believed that too, believed that what they had was something rare and precious that would have found a way to exist regardless of the obstacles. I'm glad we didn't have to wait any longer, though, Scott said, pressing a kiss to Douglas's jaw. I'm glad we were brave enough to take the risk. Me too, Douglas agreed. Best risk I ever took. When they returned from their trip, they began talking more seriously about their future together. They looked at apartments with better layouts for two people, discussed the possibility of getting a tine, made plans for holidays and vacations. Scott felt a deep sense of peace as they built their shared life, brick by brick, decision by decision. It was during one of these planning sessions that Douglas brought up the subject of marriage again. They were lying in bed on a lazy Sunday morning, laptops open as they browsed real estate listings, when Douglas suddenly closed his computer and turned to face Scott. I've been thinking about what you said last Christmas, he said, about wanting to marry me someday. Scott felt his heart rate pick up. What about it? I think someday might be sooner than we originally planned, Douglas said, his voice carefully casual. I mean, if you're ready, if you want to. Scott stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you want to spend the rest of your life with me, Douglas said, his voice growing more confident. I'm asking if you want to make this official, legal, permanent. I'm asking if you want to marry me, Scott. Scott felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. He had dreamed of this moment, had imagined how it might feel to hear Douglas propose. But the reality was overwhelming in the best possible way. His vision blurred with tears as he looked at the man he loved, the man who wanted to spend his life with him. Yes, Scott managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. Yes, of course I want to marry you. Douglas's face lit up with the most beautiful smile Scott had ever seen. Really, he asked, as if he could not quite believe Scott's answer. Really, Scott confirmed, launching himself across the bed to kiss Douglas with all the love and joy and gratitude he felt. I want to marry you more than I've ever wanted anything. They spent the rest of the morning talking about their engagement, making plans and sharing dreams for their future together. Douglas admitted that he had already started looking at rings, that he had been planning to propose for weeks, but had been waiting for the right moment. I wanted it to be perfect, Douglas said as they lay tangled together in the sheets, both of them grinning like idiots. But then I realized that any moment with you is perfect. Scott felt tears threaten again at the sweetness of Douglas's words. You don't need a ring or a fancy proposal, he said. You just needed to ask. The answer has been yes since the day I realized I was in love with you. They decided on a small wedding, just close family and friends, to be held in the fall. Scott had never been the type to dream about his wedding day, but now that it was real, he found himself excited about every detail. He wanted to celebrate their love, wanted to stand in front of the people who mattered most to them, and promised to love Douglas for the rest of his life. The months leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Scott's parents flew in from across the country, and while there had been some initial awkwardness when he first told them about Douglas, they had come to love him as a son. Douglas's family had been supportive from the beginning, and Dorothy had immediately volunteered to help with wedding planning. As the date approached, Scott found himself surprisingly calm. He had expected to be nervous, to have doubts or fears about such a big commitment, but instead he felt only excitement and certainty. Marrying Douglas felt like the most natural thing in the world, the logical next step in a love story that had always felt inevitable. The night before their wedding, they stayed apart according to tradition, Scott at his old apartment that he had kept for storage, and Douglas at home with his groomsmen. Scott lay awake staring at the ceiling, too excited to sleep, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. A year and a half ago, he had been lost and confused, going through the motions of a life that did not fit him. He had been dating women he did not really want to be with, pretending to feel things he did not feel, slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations that had nothing to do with who he really was. And then Douglas had asked him that question in the coffee shop, had seen through all his pretenses to the heart of what was really wrong, had given him permission to want something different, to be someone different, to stop forcing himself into a mold that had never been right for him. Scott thought about that scared, confused man he had been and felt a wave of compassion for him. He had been doing the best he could with the tools he had, trying to build a life that made sense according to the rules he had been taught. It was not his fault that those rules had been wrong for him, that the path he had been told to follow led away from, rather than toward his happiness. But he had been brave enough to step off that path when Douglas offered him an alternative. He had been willing to risk everything he thought he knew about himself for the possibility of something real and true and lasting. And that courage had led him here, to the night before his wedding, to the man he loved more than life itself. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect fall day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Scott woke up feeling more peaceful and happy than he could ever remember feeling, filled with anticipation for the moment when he would see Douglas waiting for him at the altar. The ceremony was everything they had dreamed of, simple and elegant and filled with love. Scott's breath caught when he saw Douglas standing at the front of the small chapel, handsome in his dark suit, his eyes bright with unshed tears. All the planning and preparation faded away, leaving only the two of them and the promises they were about to make. As they exchanged vows, Scott felt like his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it all. He promised to love Douglas through whatever came, to be his partner and his best friend, to build a life together that honored both of their dreams. Douglas's vows brought tears to Scott's eyes, filled as they were with references to their journey from friendship to love, to the courage it had taken to follow their hearts instead of their fears. When the officiant pronounced them married, when Douglas kissed him as their families cheered, Scott felt like he was floating. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for his entire life without knowing it. He was married to his best friend, his partner, his soulmate. The reception was a blur of congratulations and dancing and laughter. Scott felt like he was glowing from the inside out, high on love and champagne and the overwhelming support of everyone who mattered to them. Dorothy gave a speech that had everyone crying, talking about how she had watched her brother search for happiness his whole life, and how grateful she was that he had found it with Scott. But the moment that meant the most to Scott came late in the evening, when he and Douglas snuck away from their own reception for a few minutes alone. They stood on the balcony of the venue, looking out at the city lights, Douglas's arms wrapped around the Scott from behind. "How do you feel, Mr. Watson?" Douglas whispered in his ear, and Scott shivered at the sound of his new name. "Like the luckiest man alive," Scott replied, leaning back into Douglas's embrace. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Douglas pressed a kiss to the side of Scott's neck, and Scott felt the same electricity he had felt that very first time they kissed, the same sense of rightness and completion. "I love you, husband," Douglas said, and Scott felt tears prick at his eyes at the word. "I love you too, husband," Scott replied, turning in Douglas's arms to kiss him properly. As they stood there holding each other, Scott thought about the long road that had brought them to this moment. All the confusion and fear and uncertainty, all the false starts and wrong turns had been worth it to end up here. He thought about that night months ago when Douglas had whispered that he felt safe with Scott, when he had asked if he could fall asleep right there on Scott's couch, and how that simple request had been the beginning of everything. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Scott thought as he looked into his husband's eyes. Sometimes the thing you've been searching for your whole life is right there beside you, waiting for you to be brave enough to see it. And as Douglas kissed him again under the stars, Scott knew that they were both exactly where they needed to be, that they had found in each other the missing piece that made them whole. The scared, confused man he had been felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone who knew exactly what he wanted and would brave enough to fight for it. Their love story had started with a simple question in a coffee shop and had led them here, to this perfect moment, to this perfect life they had built together. And as they walked back into their reception, hand in hand, Scott felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought them home to each other.